Today's episode is about the match of the century. I'm sure you know the story. It is the 10th world champion, Boris Spassky, being challenged by the American Bobby Fischer. The year is 1972, Reykjavik, Iceland, the World Championship match. The first game is won by Spassky, in a drawn endgame where Fischer blunders or overpushes by playing bishop takes h2. For the second game, Fischer doesn't show up. He claims that the cameras are too noisy and refuses to continue the match until his playing conditions are met. 2-0 for Spassky. For game 3, Spassky decides to accept Fischer's conditions and play the game in a small backstage room away from the cameras. In hindsight, this seems to be a psychological mistake that gave the advantage to Fischer. He indeed wins this game. Now it's 2-1. Game 4 is a draw in a Sicilian, while Game 5 is yet another victory for Fischer with the black pieces. The score is now 2-2, and we reach the game that we are going to analyze today. Game 6, the most brilliant of the entire match. My favorite. I hope you will like it. It is Fischer with the white pieces, going for 1c4, which is an exclamation mark if we take into account that he was not an English opening player, neither a d4 player. e4 has always been Fischer's favorite first move. In fact, he said e4, best by test. So what is c4 in the first move? He wanted to surprise the Russian camp. He was facing Spassky, but let's remember that he was actually playing against the entire Soviet Union chess community. All the grandmasters in the Soviet Union were helping Boris Spassky, while Fischer was basically alone. He had a very small team helping him. c4, therefore, is an exclamation mark, since it avoids most of the preparation that the Russians came up with. The game transposes into a queen's gambit declined. Bishop g5, castle, e3, h6, bishop h4. This is all theory, and it was very topical also at the time when they played the match. Knight takes d5, and after bishop takes, queen takes, knight takes d5, e takes d5, rook c1. This is all theory. We are soon going to reach a position with hanging pawns, c5. Now the pawn structure is going to be very important here. As I mentioned, it was very topical, this variation back then, and nowadays too it is important to understand pawn structures. In this game we are going to see the hanging pawns. Hanging pawns mean that after the capture on c5, d takes c5, b takes c5, those two pawns are going to be there in the air. They are next to each other, but they don't have any b or e pawns defending them. They can be strong pawns, they can be weak pawns. This is a kind of pawn structure that has its pros and cons. Now, very important that there's a standard setup against the hanging pawns. What white should do is to put as much pressure on those two pawns as possible. The rook is already on the c file, attacking the c5 pawn, but another key move against the hanging pawn structure is to place the queen, if possible, on a3. Though there's no dark squared bishop. If there was a bishop on d6, now this move would be very bad. But since there's no dark squared bishop, this move is just the best in the position. It pins the c5 pawn, attacks it immediately. We are threatening to win the pawn. And therefore black has to protect it. Rook c8. Now bishop b5. Developing move. And after a6, white does not even have to worry about the bishop, since thanks to the queen on a3, it's a double pin, pinning the c5 pawn and the a6 pawn as well. The queen is just perfectly placed on a3 in this kind of positions. Now we are going to reach the traditional hanging pawn structure. So after the capture, this is what I was telling you about. Hanging pawns. And yeah, let's see how Fischer played against the hanging pawns. He castles. After rook a7, finally the rook is protected, so we need to move the bishop. The bishop goes back to e2, knight d7, and now here comes another very strong move, knight to d4, taking advantage of the pin that I already mentioned. Queen f8, and now a brilliant combination of moves. Capturing the bishop first in order to push e4. This is a pawn sacrifice, a very strong one. If this pawn is accepted, d takes e4, it was not played by Spassky, but if he had taken on e4, look at his pawn structure. 4 isolated pawns, all of them are very weak. targets for white, and the position is opening up for the white bishop. Bishop c4 could be played, or first queen e3, attacking this pawn, and if it's protected, just an example, queen f5, f3 could be a very strong move, opening up the position. So white is a pawn down. Remember, white is a pawn down. But after opening up the f file as well, it is the queen attacking the e6 pawn, the rook on the f5 very strong, and all the moves come by tempo, winning tempi all the time. Now either rook e1 or rook f1, this position is an advantage for white. Queen e4 is another idea, queen h7, mate threat. So this position would have been a nightmare for black. He's a pawn up, but all his pieces are passive and not coordinating. What is the rook doing on a7, for instance, you might ask? This is a very bad position for black, a lost position. Therefore, after e4, taking is not a good option. Spassky played d4. This, of course, was already a difficult moment for him to decide. e4 is an incredibly powerful move, psychologically too, remember that. So perhaps nowadays, of course, we can analyze with a computer, and the computer suggestion is knight f6, but it is still an unpleasant position. For human beings, this is unpleasant, and white should be better in any case. d4 gives up the c4 square, that's why it might not be the best. f4 now is important, and you will soon see white is important. After queen e7, e5. White makes sure that black cannot push e5. If we play any other move, let's just make a silly move for white to skip his turn. If black achieves this pawn structure, pushing his pawn to e5, with this d4 protected passed pawn there in the middle of the board, then black is actually doing all right. So everything matters, every tempo counts. And just because this position looks very nice for white, it doesn't mean that it's winning on the spot. If you are not precise, f4 and after queen e7, e5 is a key idea. Bishop c4 could have been played too, of course, and he goes for it now. So it could have been a different move order to pin the e-pawn and avoid e5 by playing bishop c4. But in the end, it would have been this position. That's very likely. I'm going to ask you to pause the video if you don't know the game. Well, if you know the game, you still might want to pause it and try to remember the variations. This is a very nice position for white. Your task is to decide how to proceed. How can you build up an attack and where to build up the attack? That is the question. You have as many minutes as you wish. Is it the queen side or the king side where we want to attack? That was a first question to answer. That's what you should ask yourself. Are we going to attack here, trying to do something about these pawns? Or b3, I don't know why I marked, by the way, bishop to b3 at best. Or is it the king side that we should look at? And the right answer is the king side. The queen side is where all the black pieces are. It's difficult to break through and have a winning attack on the flank where all the opponent's pieces are happy and protecting squares, files, ranks. Yeah, the queen side is just dominated by black. Why would we want to attack there? On the other hand, the king side is empty. It's only the king. Only the king, and the closest piece is the queen. After queen h3, the pawn is hanging on e6. Black has to protect it. Knight f8. And now Fischer plays b3, so that it prevents rook takes b2. Very logical not to give up that pawn. a5, of course, black wants to attack on the queen side. That's what he should do with his pieces there, as we mentioned already. But that's a slow plan in comparison to what white can do on the king side. And it is always stronger to attack the opponent's king and not just pawns. But there's no other option for black. Of course, he has to try to create counterplay on the queen side. Now, what happened in the game after a5 is a very strong move that you might want to guess. If you want to guess it, then pause the video. If you don't want to guess it, how to continue the attack on the king side, then just stay with me because I'm going to tell you. The move is f5. You should open up the f-file. We need more pieces, as many attacking pieces as possible. The queen is attacking already, the bishop is attacking. We need the rooks. We need to open files for the rooks so that they can join the attack. E takes f5, and now whether queen takes or rook takes, you have achieved what you wanted. Rook takes is what Fischer played because he wants to play rook f7 next move. That's a threat. That is a threat. Or simply bringing the other rook. Those are the two ideas, with the rook on f5 and keeping the queen on h3. Knight h7, and now here comes the last piece that was not joining the attack. Rook c to f1, queen d8, and now queen g3. These are not easy moves to guess. I'm not going to ask you to try to find all of them, but let's figure out what is the queen doing on g3. The point is, it used to be quite useful on h3, but it's not the case anymore. There's no e-pawn to be attacked, and there's nothing going on the h-file. So you must realize the moment when your pieces are not as useful as they used to be, and then regroup them. Find a new square, a new attacking spot for your pieces. The queen on g3 is therefore now more useful. Attacking the g7 pawn potentially after a rook f7 move, for instance. Rook e7 and h4. Another reason behind moving the queen, of course, is that you can push the h-pawn, prevent the knight jump to g5. Rook b to b7. Black is trying to defend the 7th rank as much as possible. And now e6. So both players have a passed pawn, but the d pawn is very much controlled. There's no way of pushing that pawn, while the e pawn is really dangerous. Rook f7 is always in the air. Rook b to c7, and now improving the pieces further, centralizing the queen. The queen is so powerful in the middle of the board. Queen to e5. After queen e8, here comes a move that I like a lot. It was not obligatory to push a4, but I like the fact that Fischer takes the time to prevent any sorts of counterplay. Any sorts of counterplay. a4 is not a very dangerous move. Maybe it's not even a threat, because if the queen leaves the back rank, there might be problems already with rook f8, sacrificing an exchange and then mating attack. But still, he decides that he takes one tempo just to stop everything on the queen side, fix everything on the queen side, and tell his opponent, now what? Do you have another plan? No, there's no way that black could create counterplay. Then that is really sad. Queen back to d8. This is how sad the position is for Boris Spassky. And now rook 1 to f2. Once again, a waiting move. Just seeing what's going to happen. And after queen e8, now this rook comes to f3. He could have played rook to f3 immediately, but he waited for this moment. He could do whatever he wanted. He could move the rook to d3, then to d1, then back to f1, then to f4. As long as you don't blunder, you can do whatever you want. Just don't repeat the position 3 times. So in such a dominant position, it's actually a good idea to play these waiting moves or just improve the position little by little, very much little by little, because the opponent has to stay alert, always pay attention to what you are doing. And psychologically, it is really, really frustrating that all he can do is to move the queen back and forth while you move your pieces around the way you wish. So psychologically, this is very important to sometimes not go for the kill immediately. Don't go for the most forcing variation unless it's already winning, but just improve little by little. And psychology, remember, psychology is part of the game. Now comes bishop d3, and the clear idea is ganging up on this diagonal queen and bishop battery to attack the h7 knight or threaten mate on h7. Queen e8 and now queen e4 as announced. The threat, well, for instance, rook f7, and the knight will be hanging on h7 with a mate on h7. So the knight jumps to f6 in order to go away from the very dangerous h7 square. But here, I do want you to pause the video and guess the move of Bobby Fischer. What did he play in this position? The American genius. In the midst of the Cold War, remember the scenario. This is a 2-2 situation in the match. 2 victories for both, I mean, without the draw. 2.5 if we count the score. This is the Soviet Union against the United States in the midst of the Cold War. And then we have this game. What is it that Bobby Fischer played in this position? Pause the video. Did you get it? The brilliant move is rook takes f6, sacrificing an exchange. After g takes, rook takes, there isn't a concrete win. It's not a forcing variation with mate in the end, but it is a winning attack. So what white has is a rook and a bishop and queen, plus a pawn, which means that for the sacrificed rook, he's got one bishop and a pawn. The two together is not the same value as a rook. But here material doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter in terms of numbers. What matters is that this bishop is amazingly strong. And these two rooks are very clumsy. So actually, in this position, white's bishop and the rest of his pieces, the rook on f6 and the queen on e4, they are worth a lot more than the entire camp of black. The threat is rook takes h6, of course, so king g8 was played, and now bishop to c4. There are many ways of winning here. There's not just one single winning move, but I want to show you how Fischer won the game. That's what we are focusing on. King h8, back. And well, the pawn can be taken, but instead, he just plays an even stronger move, queen f4. So you see that this pawn is hanging, even with a check, rook takes h6. Is a very strong option, but an even better move is queen f4, because it means that he can still take, and he will take, either with the rook or with the queen, plus he is threatening rook f8, check, winning the queen. So in this position, with multiple threats, Boris Spassky resigned. And this game gave the lead to Bobby Fischer, a lead that he then went on to just increase until he became world champion. The 11th world champion in September 1972. I hope that you enjoyed this game. This is a brilliant masterpiece by Bobby Fischer. Just goes to show the smooth perfection with which he played his games that made him such an idol in the United States. And the boom that Fischer created back in 1972 is still something that we miss from nowadays. How popular it became among the general audience, not just chess fans. Everyone in the country, in the United States, and all over the world knew about the match. In the midst of the Cold War, two chess grandmasters facing each other, playing a game of chess, the war on a chessboard. Now, Fischer, unfortunately, later had a kind of a paranoia that prevented him from continuing his chess career. It is really a tragic life, and I'm sure you know about his path, his career. If you haven't heard of Fischer's story, please do read about it, and also I'm recommending his books. Bobby Fischer teaches chess and his 60 most memorable games. His relation with Spassky has always been good, actually. He was among the people to whom he kept on talking. He kept in touch with Boris Spassky until the end of his life, which is really touching, knowing that the two came from such different worlds and they were on two opposite poles of the Cold War. Make sure that you check out the exercises, and as I mentioned, grab a book of Bobby Fischer and check out the rest of the games from this match of the century, 1972, Fischer-Spassky in Reykjavik, Iceland.